Support provided in part by Wyandotte Nation, Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi Native American Heritage Fund, DTE Foundation, Lazy Boy, Monroe County Community College, National Park Trust, National Park Foundation, National Park Service, River Raisin Battlefield Park Foundation. Neme, the Tribal Way. Part 1. The Life Cycle. To truly understand Lake Sturgeon and the Great Lakes today, we need to go all the way back in time to when the Great Lakes were first formed. For thousands of years, the top half of North America was covered with a thick layer of ice. 18,000 years ago, as the glacial ice began to recede and melt, the Great Lakes were formed and filled with fresh water. Lake sturgeon are an enormous, ancient, dinosaur-like freshwater fish that first appeared as glacial ice melted and formed the Great Lakes.
Biju and Disnakas, Onomaticamek and Donjaba, Anishinaabe Endau, and Jijek Dodam. So for the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, the Ogima fish, the Neme, the sturgeon, has a lot of relevance. It's one of the oldest species in the Great Lakes. So it's been here for a very long time, and it also represents the Anishinaabe being here for a very long time.
Marty Holgren is a research biologist who worked for the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians Natural Resources Department in Manistee, Michigan.
Sturgeon made their way into the Great Lakes after the glaciers receded. All of the larger rivers in the basin have sturgeon populations that didn't just show up a few hundred years ago, but they've been here for thousands of years. One of the reasons lake sturgeon are so unique is because of their large size. Average adult is around 6 feet in length, and their weight can be anywhere from 70, 80 pounds to fish being observed recently that are even up to 140 and 150 pounds. Female sturgeon, they grow longer and they are heavier than their male counterparts.
Every year since the Great Lakes were formed, melting snow and spring rain swells streams and rivers across the basin. Millions of gallons of water pour into the Great Lakes from flooded tributaries, signaling the Neme to return to spawn. As manager of Little Traverse Bay Band Hatchery, Chris Dye helps to rear thousands of lake sturgeon each year.
So males may come back as early as 15 years old. The average return age for females might be closer to 22, 25. Males spawning between 3 and 4 years out of 5. Females, it might take 3 to 5 years off between spawning events, some even longer. Sturgeon will go up the river, right, and they'll go miles. When the female goes to spawn, the males kind of rub up against her and kind of trigger that spawning action for her to release her eggs. So the average number of eggs per female is around 11,000 eggs per kilo.
Unlike some fish species, lake sturgeon do not guard or protect their eggs.
So they spawn in gravel habitats. They're looking for gravel habitats that the eggs can fall into, the spaces between the rocks. And hopefully they get out of the way of like suckers or other sturgeon coming in and trying to eat the eggs. The eggs are sticky so they stay on the rocks. The adhesion is more just to keep them in that part of the river so they don't tumble.
A week later, the eggs hatch. And the egg sac larvae, which emerge, need to quickly burrow down into the gravel.
For the sturgeon, they're actually going to go down in the sediment. In 10 days, they'll absorb their yolk sac, they'll get bigger, they won't have to eat, and they'll be safe away from predators. They use the egg sac to kind of get by them time till they can swim farther.
2 weeks after the spawn, the larvae move from the spawning grounds to their nursery habitat located downstream.
Emerge at night, drift downriver to a place where there's lots of food.
Juvenile lake sturgeon spend their first summer in shallow grass beds where they can more easily avoid being eaten by larger fish like pike and muskellunge. Only about 1% of all spawned eggs survive to hatch. Of those, only about 1% reach the drifting stage, and only about 1% will survive the drift to reach the nursery grounds. And then, only about 1% will make it through their first summer.
Up to 150 millimeters, there's almost no survival. Once you get to a certain point, it goes up very steep. Try to get our fish out in the fall. They have to be above a certain size because we know survival at that point is near 100%. Survival goes up at that size. Their scoots are probably sharper by that point. Fish just can't eat them anymore. They're more mobile. You can outrun anybody. It's a list of factors.
The majority of sturgeon that survive their first year will continue to grow and thrive in the Great Lakes. And in another 15 to 20 years, they will return to the same river where they hatched to spawn themselves.
Think about this area 1,000 years ago. Some things change and some things don't.
Lake sturgeon have been a part of the Great Lakes since the glaciers receded thousands of years ago and have always been culturally important to tribal nations. The Neme are honored by being known as the king or grandfather fish. Part 2. History with the people. The Odawa, Ojibwa, and Potawatomi, collectively known as the people of the Three Fires, were among the first people to inhabit the Great Lakes region, and their history is forever intertwined with the lake sturgeon.
And I'm going to look at it through a historical lens. This very special fish, what we call the Ogima, the king of the fish, the leader of the fish, has a lot of significance in Anishinaabe culture. Anishinaabe people would come back to their home villages, such as here at Waganuxing, land of the crooked tree, and one of the first things they would do is go into their spring fishing. And the Neme would help feed the people who were oftentimes in a starving state. It's a pretty tough time in the spring because people just made it through the winter months. The years are measured in winters because that's how severe it is. So as you make it through a winter, you earn that. And spring is a time of renewal, it's a time for new life, but it's also a time to replenish yourself. And fish is high in protein, it's high in fats, it just has everything that people need.
The Anishinaabe relied on the sturgeon spawning runs for their own survival.
Went through a lot of battles to stay in these areas like what we call Spirit Lake, part of Waganuxing, part of Onomatikamek. And one of the reasons that we fought so hard is because this is not just a familiar place, but it's a place that would feed the people. We always knew if we stayed by the Gitchagumik and the Zebuk, the rivers and the Great Lakes, that we could feed ourselves, no matter what.
The people of the Three Fires took care to utilize every part of the sacred fish.
The Ogima fish, the Neme, is used in a lot of different ways. The hide is used as like a type of leather.
Ani, Maxwell Field Indigenous, Petoskey and Dunjaba, Waganakasing Odawa Indat. The oil from the May was actually used in a hollowed out stone for simple light source and for a simple heating source. When you didn't want to burn a bigger fire, you can bust out your little sturgeon oil rock to light your way or to warm it up a little. It's one of the reasons that led to their overharvest, but because they were, again, so oily, and they were ended up using as just a direct fuel source for some of the ships within the waterways and going out into the Great Lakes.
Native communities held the Neme in much higher regard than many of the European settlers who came later.
Wasan Indigenous Nimkido dem Waganuxing Odawa Kwa Ndao. Our mindset most often is determined by ecology and not economy. So that's the big difference with the way that we work with and coexist with the land.
My name is Peggy Vriesman. I am a tribal member with Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and my clan is the Sturgeon clan. At one point in time, the spirituality and the fact that we honored all the animals, we honored the sky and the earth and the air, everything. We were not looked on as intelligent people because of it. But now, they're just coming around to our way of thinking, finally. We've always had the belief that if we don't take care of the earth, it will not take care of us.
It's the difference in between telling the environment what you want from it and asking the environment what you can do for it. There's a whole different mindset, and until those two different ways of thinking come together, I believe all the natural world is somewhat in danger.
As one of the original species to inhabit the Great Lakes, Neme hold a sacred place in Anishinaabe culture.
The sturgeon is a big part of our history, and if we forget it, if we let it die, then we're letting our history die. And a lot of our history has been lost. Sturgeon are the knowledge keepers because of the fact that they've been on Earth since the time of the dinosaur. And the longer you're on Earth, the more wisdom you acquire, and they've acquired about all the wisdom through all the ages.
A sturgeon is a sacred ancient fish.
There's also that the sturgeon lives its life in the water, and water is considered another female entity type. It carries life. It bears a lot of female significance.
The water is like liquid spirituality, and those animals that dwell inside of there are very special. And we hold them up in high reverence.
Turtle walking into water, blowing bubbles.
We would like to bring more awareness to the natural animals that come from this area. Watch them, listen to them, and help them, because they have lots of challenges that have come along their way.
What we do to the earth, what we do to the air, what we do to the water, we're doing to ourselves.
We all need to take care of the environment. We all need to take care of everything that's around us, and we can learn from one another and how to do this in the best way.
Like the Odawa and Ottawa nations in northern and western Michigan, the Potawatomi in southeast Michigan also honored the Neme, or grandfather fish. Part 3. The Numisepi. For hundreds of years, Native Americans called the big river that flowed into northwestern Lake Erie the Numisepi, or River of Sturgeon, because of the large spring spawning runs. In the 17th century, when French fur traders first paddled up the Numisepi River, it was late summer. At that time, the banks of the river were overflowing with wild grapes, leading the Frenchmen to rename it Riviera aux Raisins, or River of Grapes.
Good afternoon. My name is Douglas Taylor. I'm with the Nottawassippi Heron Band of Potawatomi. The Potawatomi's traditional migration extend from the Detroit area to include Monroe, and migrating west, southern Michigan, all the way to South Bend, that area. So when the government come in and removed us, we lost our way of life. We lost our identity.
Across the Great Lakes, European settlers overtook the areas once occupied by Native communities and initiated environmental assaults on rivers like the River Raisin that would continue for nearly 150 years.
In 1834, the Corps of Engineers said, we're going to dig a channel in from the lake right through the barrier island, and we're going to open that up for shipping, for commerce. It was quite an enterprising port for over 100 years.
Paper was king in Monroe in the early 1900s, so they'd put the paper stock out in the lagoons and kind of get treated, but rain would come along and wash all the paper stock into the river.
Then in 1932, the Corps of Engineers came back and said, we have to make that channel deeper. And when they did that, they cut off all of the sturgeon migratory routes.
Changing the river's natural flow also created new problems, as water frequently overflowed the channel and flooded the surrounding area.
Monroe is also home to a lot of flooding, and that's because took out islands. The whole Monroe area at one time they called it the Black Swamp, and it was all covered with water with a few exceptions. Farmers would get together and they would dig their own ditches and drain the land, and drain commissioners came along. A lot of the land that at one time was wetlands is now relatively dry, but by putting the drains in, you're taking away all of that wetland habitat. So your fish and your birds and the critters that would normally live there, they don't have a home anymore.
And we have more drains in Monroe County than any other place in the country, and they all have to be dredged to keep the farm fields from flooding. So the sturgeon is a victim.
Before the dawn of wastewater treatment plants, rivers across the basin were overflowing with garbage and human waste. By the 1930s, the River Raisin could no longer handle the volume of raw sewage being dumped into it every day.
In 1934, 35, Monroe built their first wastewater facility. Because Monroe is divided in half by the River Raisin, you had to get the waste from the north side of the community to south side where the new treatment plant was going to be. To do that, they took part of the riverbed off, they set tiles in there, and they built dams over the top of it. They were called beautification dams, and they figured that we would have all these nice little bitty lakes behind each and every one of the sewers that crossed. Well, what happened is those just became kind of stagnant backwaters.
By the 1940s, dams installed along 10 miles of the River Raisin further limited the lake sturgeon's ability to spawn.
We have some situations where there are fish sitting at the base of a dam for 80 years, waiting and waiting. Even if we pulled all the lower dams, a lot of times there's this link between how far the fish goes upstream and how successful their offspring are once they spawn. The farther up they can go, the better off it is for their offspring. So having multiple dams on the river is still detrimental, even if you pull just one of them. Dams manipulate the flow of the water. They can keep it so it's steady at a low flow all year long, which is not what the fish want. The fish want that spring high flow, high energy, and so once you lose that natural rhythm of the river, that also is detrimental to the sturgeon.
Sturgeon would come up, they would find the rock on rock, they'd lay their eggs, and then as the fry hatched, they could go right down to this gigantic, beautiful wetland. It's gone.
Juvenile lake sturgeon underwater. Detroit factories sent trainloads of industrial byproducts and dumped them in Monroe, further compromising the once pristine sturgeon habitat.
Put a landfill down there, and they brought waste from Detroit in smoking boxcars in the 60s. I remember looking out over here and seeing this gigantic wasteland that we'd created with the industrial dumps. It's now a big power plant. It seems that every step we took to try to correct a problem, we either somewhat corrected the problem and created a new problem, or didn't correct the problem at all and created more problems.
U.S. Representative John Dingell Jr. championed the passage of the Clean Water Act of 1972, which finally ushered in a new era of environmental stewardship in the Great Lakes.
We made great advances after the Clean Water Act.
What we had out here were big automotive production plants, and they put polychlorinated biphenyls into the water, PCBs, and that all had to be cleaned up.
Put a confined disposal area on Ford Motor Company property. Took all of the waste plus the PCBs that we got from the river, drying them in a big tight vat on Ford Motor Company property. They're there today.
The monitoring shows that PCB thing has been pretty well subdued after $150 million trying to get it cleaned up.
Restoration projects also addressed Monroe's persistent flooding and wastewater management issues.
They've done a lot in tightening up their sewers so that the sewers no longer just belch out untreated waste into the community's water. Once we put the Riverwalk in, then we prevented a lot of the flooding that had happened in the community, and especially at the wastewater facility. So that's another thing that has worked out very well for us.
Dam removal has been more of a challenging part of the river restoration.
took some of the dams out, and the dams that we couldn't take out, we put in fishways so the fish can migrate upstream.
And we also removed several dams further upstream so that now fish from Lake Erie can navigate all the way to the big dam in Dundee, Michigan, 21 miles upstream.
In 2009, an effort led by U.S. Congressman John Dingell and Senator Carl Levin to preserve the history and natural resources of the area resulted in the creation of the River Raisin National Battlefield Park. The United States has reaffirmed the rights of many Native American nations residing in the Great Lakes Basin that were denied in the wake of the battles of the River Raisin and the War of 1812. Today, the people of the Three Fires are leading the way in Lake Sturgeon restoration efforts. Part 4. Neme and the People Today. Federally recognized tribal communities are working in different ways to help restore Neme depending on their resources, goals, or whether any sturgeon remain in their area.
We're a federally recognized tribe here at Little Traverse Bay Bands, which means we have archives department, which I'm the director of. We also have education, accounting, so we have government services that go beyond our immediate citizens. So now we're becoming in this position of putting the Neme back into the lakes.
Obviously we don't have the staff and the resources to just do anything and everything we want in terms of lake sturgeon research. But ultimately, the goal would be to restore the population, reestablish our relationship with Neme, make sure they are self-sustaining.
To achieve those goals, the Little Traverse Bay Band built a fish hatchery to raise lake sturgeon and other native species.
In recent years, we have been raising sturgeon in the fish hatchery.
It's part of the Inland Fish and Wildlife Program. We've been stocking sturgeon directly into the Sturgeon River.
We'd like to put back what was taken. And that includes our language, and that includes all species that have had to deal with colonization. We're working towards putting things back the way that they once were, with all the challenges that we have in place within an economy-based culture. You can imagine this is a delicate balancing act as we balance the contemporary world with the natural world.
Bring back something that's been almost lost, not only in tradition, but environmental-wise. To me, man, that's exciting stuff. This is a win-win situation, not only for the Native American or Potawatomi, but the general public.
Satisfaction of living in harmony with your environment, where you're not decimating your resources, you're not overrunning things, you're not self-centered and egotistical to think that you are in control, but you're part of something greater, is just something I can't quite put a word on.
Juvenile lake sturgeon on river bottom. The Little River Band of Ottawa Indians is working to save a unique population of lake sturgeon on the Big Manistee River.
Our beliefs run really deep, and you can't separate the two. So if we're doing something, we're doing it not just because it's the right thing to do, but because we believe in what we're doing. It is a tangible thing that my tribe is actually doing for my clan. And they're not doing it because it's my clan, but they are doing it because it will put back some of what we have taken out. It won't put back everything that has been taken out, but it will put back part of what we have taken. It's showing respect to an old clan sign, and I respect the clan signs greatly. It's a huge sign of respect, and it shows that the tribe is not just taking, they're giving back. This is a big give back.
Clan affiliation is a traditional part of the Native American culture that continues today.
Buju, Wabzikwe Dijnakas, Name Dodem, Saginaw Chippewa, Keen, and Donjiba. I am Sturgeon clan. Name or Sturgeon is my clan, that's the family that I come from, and it kind of guides your path in life.
And they live a long time. They're slow to mature. you don't do anything right now. You stop, you think, you take a lot of thought in what you do before you make a move. A protective clan sign.
How it was explained to me about what it meant to be Sturgeon clan. The sturgeons will just swim, they just go about their business, but when fish are injured or sick, they will seek the shelter of the sturgeon, so kind of swim along with them. And you're not healing them because they have to do that themselves, but they feel safe and can take the time they need to heal themselves in your presence. So at that time, worked in a tribal school, and that made sense for what I was doing with the school and the students.
I listen very carefully to Fish Clan people. They're often really good negotiators. They can have a way of listening very well and finding a compromise.
For the Anishinaabe, Neme hold a place of reverence as one of the oldest clan signs. As lake sturgeon populations decreased, so did the number of clan members.
We are as rare as the fish itself. I'm hoping that the more sturgeon we can put into the system, the more sturgeon clan members there will be. I almost feel that because there's so few fish, that's why there's so few clan members. So if we have more of the fish, we'll have more members.
You know, Neme Sturgeon clan does seem to be rare up here, but you know, perhaps if we continue along this path, this positive pathway for sturgeon and for the community, then we'll get them to come out of the pond, right?
It got me emotional the first time I saw them release these baby sturgeon. I didn't expect that, but that's how I felt. Like, oh, being revived, and that means we will too. Because whatever happens to them happens to us.
Federal recognition has re-enabled the tribal nations in the Great Lakes to design and implement more culturally inclusive restoration programs.
Initiating these programs to bring back something that's been somewhat lost, it's a good thing for everybody.
With self-determination, the Little Traverse Bay Band has developed a unique educational program that brings Neme into Michigan classrooms. Part 5, Classroom Neme. In 2014, the Little Traverse Bay Band Education Department partnered with staff members from the tribe's fish hatchery to develop a program that would bring Neme into Michigan classrooms.
Any Amanda Weiner, Meanwhile, Wapchka Makoke, and Dijnakas. Our education department thought this would be a great opportunity to hit some standards like next generation science standards, while also teaching about Anishinaabe lifeways, historically and contemporarily, and how that feeds into the natural resources work that we do.
The tribe spent 8 months developing the classroom program before launching it at Pelston High School.
Each classroom will get a sturgeon and a tank.
And they get all the resources and the gear to take care of that fish properly through the school season.
We picked Pelston Schools because of the location, really. It's very close to the tribe's fish hatchery, also to our government building, and they do have a fairly significant amount of Little Traverse Bay Band citizens at their school, too.
Brooke Groff, a science teacher at Pelston High School, was the first teacher in Michigan to begin raising a sturgeon in a classroom.
8 years ago, the tribe had reached out to my principal, Mr. Bacon, about starting these lessons. In August, we met, and then we had sturgeon by the end of September.
The program fulfills Michigan's strict teaching standards for science curriculums, but the tribe also crafted the program to include Native American cultural lessons.
We really wanted to make sure that students are able to learn everything there is about the history of Neme to Odawa people. A lot of our educational goals of our Naganoan Education Department is to bring Anishinaabe, Odawa, Indigenous studies to any and all classrooms at all grade levels. It doesn't necessarily have to be social studies or history classrooms, which is often the case. So we want to promote it in all classrooms, and it's especially exciting to do science-related work.
The lessons are built in a way that it pulls everything together to talk about the sturgeon. Connections to history, we complete math with some of the studies that we do and the lab activities that we do. There's an engineering component with building the dams. Then there's also some English with that because they write some papers.
When we have teachers reach out to us that they feel like they can't teach it if they're not native. And that's also my role, to be here to be able to give them more support in doing that, so that we can bring these kind of things to the classroom, because Native education is for everyone.
Bucket full of small sturgeon released. The program has improved a lot since the first fish was delivered to Brooks' classroom.
So this is actually the 4th tank that I've had. My first tank was small and we had to do more care to make sure that the nitrogen containing compounds didn't get to be too much for the sturgeon. We feed the sturgeon bloodworms based on their body weight. Students take the mass of the sturgeon each week on Mondays, and then they know how much to feed them during the week.
Keeping the sturgeon healthy in classroom tanks requires expertise in fish management. A sensor inside the tank enables hatchery staff to assess and monitor classroom tanks remotely.
If something were to change in the tank that would harm the sturgeon, Chris would receive a text alert.
I raise all the sturgeon for the Sturgeon in the Classroom program, Saginaw and North.
Before remote monitoring was incorporated, Chris could only help by showing up at the school in person and assessing the situation.
I do remember a time when Pellston had their fish in a 55-gallon tank, and Brooke had called us and was like, I'm changing the water out every day and it's just not getting any cleaner. And so I was like, well, I'll come by. I got there and her fish were enormous. And that was the first time we were like, we need a bigger tank. And once she started having these issues, they stopped growing. And when we switched the tank over, it took off again. You can actually see these fish were stressed out, and now that they're happy again in a healthy environment, they're growing like crazies.
Often an obstacle for teachers to decide to take on this program is the commitment of making sure that the fish is fed over weekends or over long breaks.
And it's quite the responsibility because you have to feed the sturgeon every day. You have to take care of the animal, and that includes weekends, holidays.
I do come up on the weekends to feed the sturgeon. It does take some time, but the tribal education department and the guys at the hatchery are very helpful. The value of what the students get out of it is worth my time.
The Little Traverse Bay Band program aims to teach students not only about fish, but also about career opportunities in natural resources management.
Another great thing that we get when we tour the hatchery, they see what fisheries biologists do. And then when we go to the release, they see other biologists in the river. And so they get a chance to see some of the careers that you could have that helps them to see like what a 4-year degree could do.
At the end of the school year, the tribe hosts a special afternoon event for the students and the sturgeon. Each fish is blessed with a traditional song and ceremony before being released.
The release day, we want to make sure that we're putting the fish, the neme, into the water in a really good way. We gather everyone around, and then we each have a pinch of tobacco or sema in our left hand, and then we bring it together as a group, and then we have students bring the whole collective good thoughts into the water before we release the neme.
We really like the release event because it's a great closing. It brings all the pieces together and the kids can see that connection between the tribe and the sturgeon and the work that we did all year.
One of the favorite parts about it all, we have sturgeon release ceremonies, and those are generally a public event where anyone can come. Ultimately creates more sturgeon awareness and love throughout the community, going forward as that program continues to expand into more and more classrooms in the state.
I think it's really beautiful and a way for us to reach out and show the community that we're working for the well-being of the balance of the earth, and therefore we have very high hope in humanity to continue that.
Part 6. Streamside Neme. In Manistee, the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians are using a different approach to build community appreciation for Neme in the Big Manistee River.
Almost 20 years ago, I was hired by the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians, and I was fresh out of graduate school and was hired to work with them on understanding and managing the lake sturgeon population. And I remember getting there and starting having a discussion and realizing that the scientific knowledge that I had was only a piece. And what I learned from them giving me their history and their knowledge of lake sturgeon, that we needed to incorporate so much more into how we treated lake sturgeon.
When the Little River Band decided to launch a Neme restoration program, they faced several cultural challenges.
20 years ago, that you would basically take fish, raise them in a hatchery from eggs, and then you'd go to a site, a remote site, and release those. Those fish and the eggs didn't necessarily come from that location. But for the tribe, that wasn't acceptable because we had a population that we knew it was spawning. And we knew also that that population was unique. It was believed that we had likely around 100 to 300 fish. And we deemed that as a population that was critically low. And we didn't know how many females were in that population. If we just had a single sturgeon population, because of the genetics were all the same, it doesn't give them the same protection that we have these different populations that have a similar but a different genetic makeup. And that's a strength, right? We have strength in numbers. So we had to come up with a strategy that was respectful of that, and also recognizing that it wasn't just the sturgeon that had come back for thousands of years, but the tribe had a sacred relationship with this fish.
Ideally, they'd be reproducing naturally, wouldn't require any artificial or unnatural enhancement or stocking, but we're probably a long way from there, but that is the end goal.
Adult lake sturgeon underwater. MSU Black Lake Research Facility. Researchers have determined that imprinting plays a key role in successful lake sturgeon spawning.
Imprinting it's an interesting thing because we know it happens. And we have ideas of how the imprinting occurs, but it's still largely unknown. And there are efforts underway in the Great Lakes Basin where we're trying to understand that more specifically, because if we can understand what those cues are, then we can make sure that our management strategies are really appropriate. But there are a few that migrate into other rivers, and that's probably an evolutionary strategy, because it allows for genetics to stay diverse. And we know imprinting, it happens in a very strong way.
The goal then was to design a program utilizing tribally approved methods that protected and increased the survival of naturally spawned Neme in the Big Manistee River.
So that's how really the idea of the streamside rearing facility, I'm going to say, was hatched. It was coming up with a way to be culturally appropriate and scientifically appropriate to imprint those fish.
Allowing the Neme to spawn naturally was a key guideline of the Little River Band's program and a departure from prevailing methods.
Standard practice at that time, that wasn't acceptable. You had to come up with something that was culturally appropriate.
The tribe wanted to preserve natural selection by having the Neme pick their partners rather than well-intentioned researchers. Only naturally spawned eggs could be used.
We used a contraption from a researcher in Canada where he basically just wrapped these cinder blocks with furnace filters. Because once the eggs leave the female's body, they become adhesive. And then they stick the material, usually coarse material like the gravel or cobble.
Hatchlings are also collected during their larval drift.
There's a lot of challenges with streamside rearing. One is we had to go out in the springtime at night and try to catch those inch-long larvae, the offspring of those adults that were coming in to spawn.
There's a larval drift survey that occurs late May, early June. The basic premise there is setting out these cone-shaped drift nets, which have a little cylindrical container at the end, which you can unscrew and count all the fish that will drift into it.
The naturally spawned eggs collected from the furnace mats and larvae from drift surveys are all carefully transported to the streamside facility.
gave us the ability to raise eggs and to raise larvae. That would make sure that we were representing as many of the male and female pairs that we could within that population. And then once you get into that, the fish into that facility, is making sure that we were taking care of them in the most effective and appropriate way. We didn't want to change the water chemistry and the minerals within that water because it may be important for the imprinting, but we did have to put things in like filters.
Sharing knowledge is another core value of Native American culture, and one of the guiding mandates for the Little River Band program was that it be easily replicated by others.
One of the main considerations for this project is that we wanted it to be something that could be replicated across the basin. So it was affordable. It didn't take a humongous staff and a large burden to be successful. It was exciting when we finally started to see those trailers showing up elsewhere within the basin.
Releasing the Namay in the fall is an important aspect of the tribal restoration program and a popular public event.
You had the Native American population and the non-Native population coming to the same place. They were there for the same reason, and it was this unifying time where it didn't matter where you were from, but you were celebrating your watershed and interacting in that same space. We'd walk down to the river and there'd be lake sturgeon in buckets, and you'd have kids and adults and elders carrying these down. And it was very rewarding to see people holding one fish and it would swim away, and they'd stand there for 2 or 3 minutes and making sure that that fish was swimming into a safe place. And so we've seen really a societal shift within the last 20 years where people may not have even known what a sturgeon was. Now I would say most everyone in Manistee not only knows what it is, but is connected in a deep and profound way.
Streamside rearing facilities are now a leading model for Great Lakes lake sturgeon restoration.
Starting to see the fish that were raised in streamside rearing facilities returning back to those rivers of origin. And it's an exciting time because the indication is that this population is starting to recover. One of the rewarding pieces for me, and being a non-tribal biologist coming into their community, it was a large learning experience for me. It really transcends just putting fish in the water, but it affects people's lives. Now the tribes have the right to be able to go out and determine for themselves what those actions are going to be in the future that help their communities, and in turn help all of our communities be a better place, a more diverse place to live.
Federal recognition has re-enabled tribal nations in the Great Lakes to design and implement more culturally inclusive lake sturgeon restoration programs with outstanding results. Today, Native American traditional ecological knowledge and cultural beliefs are guiding many lake sturgeon restoration projects. As those efforts continue, the collective hope is that future generations will once again see rivers in the Great Lakes like the Numissepi swell in the spring with spawning sturgeon. Produced and directed by Kathy Johnson. Video by Greg Lashbrook. Music by Frank Montano, Redcliffe, Ojibwe, Andrew Noyes. Narration by Mary Ellen Murphy. Additional support by Nation, Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi, Little River Band of Ottawa, Little Traverse Bay of Odawa, Wyandot Nation of Oklahoma, Wyandot of Anderton Nation, Native American Heritage Fund, DTE Foundation, Lazy Boy, Monroe County Community College, National Park Trust, National Park Foundation, National Park Service, River Raisin National Battlefield Park Foundation. Special thanks to Chris Dye, Maxwell Field, Little Traverse Bay of Odawa, Renee Dillard, Little Traverse Bay of Odawa, Peggy Vriesman, Little River Band of Ottawa, Melissa Isaac, Saginaw, Chippewa, Douglas Taylor, Nottawasepi Huron Band of Potawatomi, Dick Micka, Dan Stefanski, Amanda Weinert, Little Traverse Bay Band, Brooke Groff.